What if one moment could change everything? John Cena was just looking for some peace, but what he found was something far more dangerous. As the night unfolds, he's faced with a choice: walk away or stand for what's right. Stay until the end to see a story of courage and justice. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. The evening breeze carried a crisp, fresh scent as John Cena walked along the paved path of a quiet park. He had pulled his cap low over his forehead, enjoying the rare moment of solitude away from flashing cameras and the chaos of fame. Dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, he relished the anonymity. He wasn't here to be a celebrity, just a man taking a break from a world that constantly demanded more. The distant laughter of children echoed from a nearby playground, a reminder of simpler times. As he rounded a bend, deep in thought, the sudden impact of another body caught him off guard. He staggered slightly, but steadied himself quickly. Standing before him was an elderly black woman in a neatly pressed military uniform, her polished metals glinting under the fading sunlight. A cane was gripped firmly in her hand, and dark sunglasses obscured her eyes. "I'm terribly sorry," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I should have been more careful." John took a step back, his irritation fading instantly. He noticed how carefully she moved, the way she subtly adjusted her stance as if relying more on instinct than sight. Then it hit him. She was blind. "It's fine," he replied, his voice calmer now. "No harm done. Are you okay?" She nodded, shifting her cane slightly. "Yes, just a little clumsy, I suppose." John hesitated, something about her drawing his attention. He wasn't sure if it was the way she carried herself, with quiet dignity despite her obvious struggles, or the silent strength in her voice. He couldn't just let her walk away. "Wait," he said, stepping forward slightly. "Would you let me treat you to dinner? It's the least I can do after our little collision." The woman turned her head slightly in his direction, a polite smile forming. "Oh, that's very kind of you, but there's no need. I'm perfectly fine." John returned the smile, though his was more insistent. "I insist. Consider it an apology for my part in it. Besides, I could use the company." She paused, seemingly considering his offer. Then, after a moment, she nodded. "Well, if you insist. My name is Marion James, by the way." "John," he said, deliberately omitting his last name. "Nice to meet you, Marion." "Nice to meet you too, John," she replied. Together, they started toward a small cafe visible at the end of the park's pathway. John adjusted his pace to match hers, ensuring she never had to rush. As they walked, light conversation flowed between them. He learned that Marion had served as a combat medic in Iraq, a veteran of countless battles where she had saved lives under the worst conditions imaginable. The price of her service had been her sight. A grenade explosion had robbed her of it, leaving her in darkness for the past 2 decades. But, despite everything, she spoke with no resentment, no self-pity. Only the kind of quiet resilience that came from surviving the impossible. By the time they arrived at the cafe, John found himself deeply intrigued. Hollywood was full of fake bravery, but Marion was the real thing. He held the door open for her, guiding her toward a booth by the window. The cafe was quiet, occupied only by a few scattered patrons. A friendly-looking waitress approached, and John ordered for both of them, opting for something hearty and warm. As they waited for their food, John found himself studying Marion. How she held herself, how she listened so intently, how she navigated a world she could no longer see. "You don't have to feel awkward around me," she said suddenly, as if sensing his thoughts. John chuckled, shaking his head. "Was it that obvious?" She smiled. "A little. People get nervous when they don't know what to say. They look at blindness like it's some kind of tragedy, something that makes a person less. She tilted her head slightly. But I don't see it that way. John leaned forward, genuinely curious. How do you see it? Marion ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the table, as if grounding herself in the space. Life doesn't stop because you lose something. You just have to find new ways to keep moving. Their conversation stretched on, touching on her late husband, a kind and patient man who had been her rock after the war, and her estranged son, a man who had fallen into addiction and trouble with the law. Marion never complained, never sought pity. She simply told her story the way a soldier would, honest, unembellished, without expectation of sympathy. John found himself humbled by her presence. Their meal arrived and they ate slowly, continuing their discussion. For once, John didn't have to talk about movies, fame, or the superficial nonsense that came with being a celebrity. With Marion, he was just a man having dinner with someone worth listening to. But as their meal neared its end, John reached into his pocket only to find it empty. A sinking feeling hit him. My wallet, he muttered, sitting up straighter. I think I left it in the park. Marion's expression remained calm. It happens, she said simply. John exhaled, standing. I'll be right back. Do you mind waiting here while I check? Of course, she nodded. John hurried out, retracing his steps through the park. His mind raced. He could have sworn he'd had it when they walked in, but after searching the pathway twice, he found nothing. When he returned to the cafe empty-handed, Marion was still seated calmly at the booth. John sighed, sitting down across from her. No luck. I must have dropped it somewhere else. Marion smiled lightly. These things happen. Don't worry, I can take care of it. John shook his head. No way. This is my treat. The waitress, having overheard the conversation, leaned in with a reassuring smile. No worries, Mr. Cena. We know who you are. You can settle it later. John chuckled. So much for anonymity. Thanks, I appreciate that. As he turned back to Marion, the cafe door swung open with a heavy thud. A new presence entered the room, one that immediately set off alarms in John's instincts. He looked up and spotted a large, burly man dressed in a worn leather jacket adorned with patches. His unkempt beard and cold stare gave him a menacing air. The man scanned the room before his gaze settled directly on Marion. His lips curled into a faint smirk. John's body tensed instinctively. Years in the wrestling ring and Hollywood action films had given him a sixth sense for trouble before it arrived. The stranger took a few slow steps toward a nearby table, but his eyes never left Marion. John stayed seated, his focus locked on the man. He didn't like this, not one bit. Something told him this night wasn't over. John remained seated, his gaze fixed on the burly man who had just entered the cafe. The stranger's stare lingered on Marion, his smirk widening as he leaned against a nearby table. He wasn't just looking. He was studying her, as if sizing her up for something. John had been around enough hostile men to recognize the signs of someone itching for trouble. Marion, unaware of the man's gaze, continued speaking. "Did you find your wallet?" she asked casually. John forced himself to refocus. "No, but I'll deal with it later," he said, keeping his voice even while his instincts remained on high alert. His eyes flickered back toward the man, who still hadn't looked away. The stranger shifted slightly, cracking his knuckles as he finally spoke. "Well, well, ain't this a sight?" he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. His voice was thick with something oily, condescending. "Didn't think I'd see a washed-up old monkey in a uniform today." The room seemed to freeze. John clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists under the table. He felt a surge of heat rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Not yet. Marion, still unaware of the man's presence, remained composed. "Is someone talking to me?" she asked, her head tilting slightly. The man chuckled darkly. "Yeah, sweetheart, I'm talking to you. Just curious how a blind old nut—" John stood up fast enough to shake the table, his towering presence casting a shadow over the man. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath. "Watch your mouth." John's voice was low, dangerous. The man smirked, clearly enjoying himself. "Oh, what's this now? The big movie star's gonna play hero?" He took a step closer, his stained teeth flashing in a grin. "Didn't peg you for the type to babysit old war relics. What's next? You gonna feed her too?" John exhaled slowly. His patience was razor thin. "You got a problem?" The man leaned in, his breath reeking of cheap beer and cigarettes. "Yeah, I got a problem. I don't like seeing people like her walking around like they belong here." His beady eyes glinted with malice. "Ain't nothing worse than a black B asterisk H who thinks she's important. Dot asterisk asterisk." The moment those words left his mouth, the entire room seemed to tilt. John's hand shot out with lightning speed, grabbing the man's wrist before he even realized what was happening. The strength behind his grip was unforgiving, causing the man's smirk to falter. "I'm going to give you one chance," John said, his voice a barely contained growl. "Apologize, right now." The man yanked his arm, but John didn't budge. His fingers tightened like a vice, forcing a pained grunt from the man's throat. "You don't tell me what to do," the man spat, masking his discomfort with bravado. "You think you're something special? I don't give a damn who you are. This is our town, our place, not hers." John's knuckles whitened. The sheer hatred in this man's voice sent something dark curling in his stomach. Before the situation could escalate further, a second figure entered the cafe. A second biker, just as large, if not larger, than the first. He had a shaved head, a long, tangled beard, and a Nazi tattoo proudly displayed on his exposed forearm. John instinctively positioned himself between the two men and Marion. The new arrival grinned, as if delighted by the tension. "Problem here, Rick?" he asked, glancing between them. Rick, the first man, yanked his arm free while sneering. "Nah, just educating the big guy here on how things work." John's entire body remained coiled like a loaded spring, ready for anything. He glanced around. The other cafe patrons were stiff with fear, some looking away, others frozen in place. Rick crossed his arms, his confidence returning with backup at his side. "You know, I've got a real issue with your friend here," he said, nodding toward Marion. "I mean, look at her. She's what, 80, and still leeching off the government, taking our tax money?" Marion's lips pressed together, but she remained silent. Rick continued. "She spent her life fixing up soldiers who should have been left to rot, and now we're all supposed to be grateful? Hell no. She should have died over there with the rest of them." John's heart pounded in his ears. He wanted nothing more than to crush the air out of this man's throat, but Marion's voice cut through the tension before he could act. "I've heard better insults from dying men in a war zone," she said calmly. Rick's smirk wavered. Marion tilted her head slightly toward John. "You can sit down now, John. He's not worth it." John inhaled sharply. Marion was right. This scumbag wasn't worth a fight yet. Rick let out a low laugh. "That's adorable. You really think you can just ignore me?" John kept his stance rigid. His instinct screamed that this wasn't over. Rick nodded to his tattooed friend. "Come on, Duke. We'll let this slide, for now." But as they turned to leave, Rick leaned in close, whispering just loud enough for John to hear. "Next time, she won't be so lucky." John's hands flexed, knuckles cracking. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. John turned to Marion. "Are you okay?" She exhaled slowly, but her expression remained unreadable. "That's not the first time I've dealt with men like them." "Yeah, well, it's not going to be the last," John muttered. Marion adjusted her cane, nodding. "I know." The moment should have passed, but something felt unfinished. The way Rick had said that last sentence, it wasn't an idle threat. John glanced toward the window just in time to see the two bikers lingering near their motorcycles, still watching them. And then Rick grinned. A slow, deliberate grin, before making a gun gesture with his fingers, pointing it directly at Marion. John's muscles tensed all over again. This wasn't over, not even close. John Cena sat back down at the table, but his entire body remained tense. His eyes were still locked on the two bikers standing outside by their motorcycles, their grins filled with malicious amusement. The gun gesture Rick had made toward Marion sent a wave of anger rolling through John's chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Not yet. Not here. Marion, on the other hand, seemed unbothered, sipping the last of her coffee as if nothing had happened. "You really didn't flinch," John said, watching her closely. Marion smirked slightly. "I've faced worse. You don't spend decades in war zones without learning how to handle threats." She tapped her cane lightly against the floor. "Besides, cowards like them only bark when they think no one will bite back." John's jaw tightened. "Yeah, well, I'm not the type to let threats slide." Marion turned her head slightly toward him as if assessing his tone. "John, you can't fight every battle with your fists." John exhaled, shaking his head. "This isn't just some bar fight. Guys like that, they don't just throw words around for fun, they follow through." Marion set down her cup. "Then we'll deal with it when the time comes." John wasn't sure whether to admire her composure or be frustrated by it. But deep down, he knew she was right. Acting impulsively now would only escalate things. He just had to hope the bikers would walk away. But then he heard the heavy thud of boots approaching the cafe again. John turned his head just as Rick and Duke re-entered the building. The air in the room shifted immediately. Conversations died down, and the few remaining patrons shrank back into their seats. The waitress by the counter froze in place, her eyes darting toward John as if silently pleading for him not to let things get out of hand. Rick grinned, moving with slow, deliberate steps toward their table. Duke followed, his massive arms crossed over his chest, the Nazi tattoo on his forearm fully exposed. The two of them were blocking the exit, cutting off any easy escape. John pushed his chair back slightly, keeping his movements controlled. Rick placed his hands on the table and leaned forward, his rancid breath filling the space between them. "You see, Johnny boy, I got a real problem with how you talked to me earlier." His voice was low, taunting. "You embarrassed me in front of a whole damn cafe." John didn't react. His heartbeat was steady, his muscles loose but ready. Rick's grin widened. "And now, I think it's only fair that I return the favor." Before John could respond, Rick's hand shot out, grabbing Marion's medals and yanking them hard. The ripping sound of the fabric echoed through the silent cafe. Marion gasped as the medals were snatched from her uniform, the sudden force nearly pulling her forward. John moved instantly. His hand lashed out like lightning, catching Rick's wrist in a crushing grip. The biker yelped in pain, trying to yank his arm back, but John didn't let go. Instead, he squeezed harder, his grip like iron. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," John said, his voice a dangerous whisper. Rick's cocky smirk vanished, replaced by the first glimmer of uncertainty. Duke reacted fast, reaching for something at his belt, a knife. John didn't hesitate. He whipped Rick's arm down with a brutal force, making the biker crash face first into the table. The entire cafe erupted into chaos as John spun toward Duke. Duke lunged with the knife, aiming for John's ribs. But John, his instincts honed by years of training, sidestepped smoothly, grabbing Duke's wrist and twisting it violently. The knife clattered to the floor, and John used the opening to slam his elbow into Duke's face. Blood sprayed from Duke's nose, and he stumbled back with a curse. Rick, now recovered, roared in rage and charged. John met him head-on. Rick swung wildly, aiming a haymaker punch at John's jaw. John ducked effortlessly, then countered with a devastating uppercut that sent Rick crashing backward over a chair. Duke, still dazed, reached for a beer bottle from a nearby table and smashed it against the counter, turning it into a jagged weapon. John's expression remained calm, deadly. "Really?" he muttered. Duke lunged again, slashing at him with the broken bottle. John sidestepped, then caught Duke's wrist and twisted it back at an unnatural angle. Duke screamed as his own momentum sent him crashing face first into the counter, the bottle slipping from his fingers. Rick was back on his feet, grabbing a metal chair and swinging it overhead. John caught it mid-swing with both hands and yanked it free with brutal strength, then used it to smash Rick across the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. The cafe was in total chaos now. Tables overturned, dishes shattered, chairs scattered across the floor. Both bikers were down, but not out. Rick coughed, his breath ragged. "You're gonna regret this, Cena," he spat, wiping blood from his lip. John stepped forward, looming over him. "I doubt that." Then, from outside, the sound of more motorcycles rumbled in the distance. John's stomach tightened. More were coming. Rick grinned through his bloody teeth. "You think this is over? You just started a war." John clenched his fists. No, this war was already here. The low rumble of motorcycles outside sent a cold wave of tension through the cafe. John Cena stood over Rick and Duke, his fists still clenched, his breathing controlled but heavy. The two bikers were beaten but not broken, and the sadistic grin on Rick's bloodied face made it clear that this fight was far from over. The momentary silence inside the cafe was shattered by the distinct screech of tires as more bikers pulled up outside. John's eyes flicked to the window, where at least 5 more men, dressed in leather and denim, climbed off their bikes. They moved with purpose, cracking their knuckles, grinning with cruel anticipation. The symbol on their jackets, a snarling wolf wrapped in barbed wire, made John's stomach tighten. This wasn't just some random gang. This was the Hell Wolves, a group notorious for their hate-driven violence and deep-rooted connections with white supremacist groups. Inside, Rick chuckled through bloodied teeth, pushing himself up onto his elbows. "Told you, Cena," he coughed, wincing. "You just picked a fight you ain't gonna walk away from." John glanced at Marion, who still sat upright in the booth, her expression unreadable. If she was afraid, she didn't show it. But John knew that wasn't the point. She wasn't the one in danger. He was. The front door slammed open, and in stepped the leader of the Hell Wolves. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his long, gray-streaked beard giving him a grizzled but commanding presence. A deep scar ran across his cheek, and his cold blue eyes locked onto John with an expression of pure amusement. So, the man drawled, his voice gravelly, thick with southern venom. You're the big hero, huh? He let his gaze flick briefly toward Marion. Standing up for a washed-up old relic like her? John's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. The leader smirked, glancing down at Rick, who was still struggling to get up. Damn, Cena, you got my boy here looking like he went 10 rounds with a truck. He stepped forward, his boots clomping heavily on the tiled floor. See, that's a problem, 'cause out here we got rules, and rule number 1 is you don't mess with us. John remained still, calculating his next move. He could take 2, 3 of them, maybe even 4, but not 7 armed men in a closed space. The leader leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Tell you what, since you're a big-time celebrity, we'll be real generous. You get down on your knees right here, right now, and you apologize to my boys. Beg for it. John didn't flinch. Not gonna happen. The leader's smirk vanished. Then we do this the hard way. Without warning, one of the bikers lunged forward, swinging a chain aimed directly at John's head. John ducked at the last second, the metal links whistling past his ear. He countered instantly, driving a fist into the attacker's gut, then following up with a brutal uppercut that sent the man crashing into a table. But the others were already moving. 2 bikers charged at John simultaneously. The first swung a bar stool, trying to break it over John's back, but John rolled forward, avoiding the impact. The second one tried to grab him from behind, locking his arms around John's torso, attempting to pin him down. John planted his feet, bent his knees, and exploded upward, flipping the man clean over his back and onto the floor with a sickening thud. More bikers jumped in. One managed to land a hard punch to John's ribs, making him stumble back, but he recovered quickly, grabbing the man's jacket and hurling him straight into the counter, knocking over cups and plates in the process. The leader watched the chaos unfold, shaking his head in amusement. Damn shame, he muttered, pulling a knife from his belt. Coulda made this easy. He lunged. John barely dodged in time, stepping to the side as the blade sliced through the air, missing his stomach by inches. The leader was fast, but John was faster. He caught the man's wrist mid-swing, twisted it sharply, and forced the knife out of his grasp. Then, with a single fluid motion, John flipped the leader over his shoulder, slamming him onto the tile floor with a force that made the entire cafe shake. For a brief moment, the only sound was the heavy breathing of beaten men. Then came the distant wail of police sirens. The remaining bikers froze. Rick, still slumped against a broken chair, cursed under his breath. Shit. The leader, still on the floor, let out a pained laugh. Guess you got lucky tonight, Cena. John exhaled slowly, keeping his guard up as the police cars screeched to a halt outside. Officers poured in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. One of them, a stocky sergeant with a hard-lined face, pushed to the front, his eyes scanning the scene before landing on Rick and his crew. John expected the arrest to begin, but then the sergeant's face twisted in something almost like disappointment. He turned his head slightly, muttering to one of his men, "Tell dispatch we'll need to clean this up quietly." John's stomach dropped. Rick and the others weren't handcuffed. They weren't being thrown to the ground or read their rights. Instead, the sergeant walked up to Rick and offered him a hand. "You okay, Rick?" Rick wiped his bloody mouth, smirking. "Been better." John's blood boiled. This wasn't just a random group of bikers. They had police protection. The sergeant finally turned to John, giving him a cold look. "Cena, I suggest you get out of here before you make things worse for yourself." John clenched his fists, his body still buzzing with adrenaline. "You're really gonna let them walk?" The sergeant's expression didn't change. "This ain't your fight." John took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. The odds weren't in his favor anymore. Not here, not now. He turned to Marion. "Come on," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Marion nodded once, standing with her cane. She didn't need help, but John stayed close anyway as they made their way past the officers. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hitting their skin, Rick called after them. "This ain't over, Cena," he shouted. "You got no idea what you just started." John didn't look back. He already knew. John Cena walked alongside Marion in silence, his mind racing. The corruption, the connections, the absolute audacity of the police to side with those racist thugs, it all burned inside him like a fire he couldn't put out. Rick and his crew should have been thrown in the back of a police car, not helped to their feet like victims. And the way the sergeant had spoken to him, dismissing him like he was the problem, made it all the more infuriating. This wasn't just a random attack. It was systemic. These men operated like they were untouchable because in some ways they were. Marion's cane tapped against the sidewalk as they moved away from the cafe, her pace steady, unshaken. John glanced at her, expecting her to say something, but she remained silent. "You knew," he finally said. Marion exhaled. "I suspected. Racist scum like them don't last this long without protection." John clenched his fists. "You've dealt with them before." "Oh, plenty," Marion replied. "Maybe not them specifically, but men like them. They've been around forever. They like to make it clear who runs things and who doesn't belong. They couldn't break me then, and they sure as hell won't now." John admired her strength, but it didn't make the situation any less frustrating. "They're gonna come after me," he said bluntly. "You heard Rick. He won't let this go." Marion tilted her head toward him. "And what are you going to do about it?" John let out a slow breath, his pulse still pounding. "I'm not going to sit back and do nothing." Marion nodded approvingly. "Then let's make it count." John frowned. "What do you mean?" She stopped, gripping her cane tightly. "I mean, this isn't just about you. You saw what happened in there. That cop? He was never going to arrest them, because men like Rick, they don't just control gangs, they control people. They use fear. And the only way to beat men like that is to shine a light so bright on them that they can't hide in the dark anymore." John considered her words. "You have a platform," Marion continued. "You have power in ways they don't. You think they hate you now? Wait till you make sure everyone sees them for what they are." John had spent his career entertaining people, putting on a show, being larger than life. But this was real. This was a fight that mattered. He made a decision. "I'm going to expose them." Marion smiled. "Good." John pulled out his phone, opening up his social media. He hesitated. He had millions of followers, people who would listen. But this wasn't just a movie promo or a charity post. This was going to start something. He hit record. "I'm John Cena, and tonight I saw something that I can't ignore. I saw a group of racist thugs attack a blind veteran, a woman who gave everything for this country just because of the color of her skin. I saw the police show up, and instead of doing their jobs, they protected the criminals. I want everyone watching this to understand that this isn't a one-time incident. This is what happens when people think they can get away with it. And I'm telling you now, I'm not letting them." He ended the video and hit upload. It didn't take long. Within minutes, the post was being shared thousands of times. His inbox flooded. News outlets picked it up almost immediately. People were angry. They demanded answers. Who were these bikers? Why weren't they arrested? Who was the sergeant who let them walk? The story was gaining traction, and fast. Then John's phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Yeah?" A slow, mocking chuckle came through the speaker. "Well, well, Cena, you really don't know when to quit, do you?" John's jaw tightened. "Rick." "That's right," Rick's voice drawled. "Guess I shouldn't be surprised. You always did like playing the hero." John didn't respond. Rick continued. "See, here's the problem. You're making a lot of noise, and noise like that, it gets people real interested in things they ain't supposed to see. That ain't good for business." John's grip on the phone tightened. "You should have thought of that before you put your hands on Marion." Rick laughed. "She's nothing. You think anyone actually gives a damn about some blind old black woman? They'll forget about her in a week. But you're pissing off the wrong people, Cena." John's pulse hammered in his ears. "You threatening me?" "I'm telling you how this works," Rick replied smoothly. "You take that video down, you shut your mouth, and maybe, just maybe, we'll let this go. Otherwise," he let the silence stretch for a moment. "Accidents happen." John's teeth gritted. "Come and try." Rick chuckled again. "Have it your way." The line went dead. John lowered the phone, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't an empty threat. Rick and his crew were dangerous, and now they had every reason to come after him. He turned to Marion, who had been listening quietly. "You still sure about this?" he asked. Marion smiled. "I've been fighting my whole life. I'm not stopping now." John nodded. "Then neither am I." That night, John didn't sleep. His phone kept buzzing, messages from reporters, calls from friends warning him to be careful, even some anonymous threats telling him to back off. But he wasn't backing off. He started digging, and what he found made his blood run cold. The Hellwolves weren't just some gang of racist bikers. They were deeply connected to politicians, to law enforcement, to business owners who used them for intimidation. The sergeant from earlier, he'd covered up multiple hate crimes, swept them under the rug. John sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. Marion had been right. This wasn't just about a fight in a cafe. This was a system. And now, John was right in the middle of it. There was no turning back, and he wouldn't have it any other way. John Cena stood in his dimly lit hotel room, his laptop screen illuminating his face as he scrolled through files, news reports, and social media posts. The deeper he dug, the worse it got. The Hellwolves weren't just a group of racist bikers. They were a well-connected network tied to corrupt law enforcement, dirty politicians, and underground criminal activities. Rick wasn't some random thug. He was part of something much bigger. And now, John had painted a target on his own back. His phone vibrated again. Another notification. His social media post exposing the attack on Marion had exploded, reaching millions. Celebrities were sharing it. News outlets were picking it up. Veterans were speaking out, demanding justice. The public outrage was growing and the pressure was mounting. But with that pressure came retaliation. His phone rang. Unknown number. John answered. "You just don't learn, do you?" Rick's voice was smug, but there was an underlying edge of frustration. John exhaled slowly. "I told you, you don't scare me." Rick chuckled. "That's cute. But see, you don't get it. This ain't some action movie, Cena. You keep this up, and people you care about are gonna get hurt. Maybe that blind old hag. Maybe someone else." John's grip on the phone tightened. "You come near Marion again, and I'll make sure you regret it." Rick ignored the warning. "You want to play hero? Fine. But understand this, you ain't fighting a bunch of dumb bikers. We own this city. We got cops, judges, business owners in our pocket. You think one viral video is going to change that?" John let the silence stretch for a beat. "It already has." Rick's smugness faltered for the first time. "Yeah? Let's see how cocky you are when the people protecting you start turning their backs." The line went dead. John lowered the phone, his jaw tight. A knock at the door made him tense. He moved cautiously, checking the peephole before unlocking it. Marion stood there, her cane resting lightly against her palm. "You okay?" she asked, stepping inside. John closed the door behind her. "Rick just called. He's rattled, but that means we're getting to them." Marion nodded. "Good. That means we push harder." John gestured to his laptop. "I've been looking into them. The Hell Wolves are more than just a gang. They have real power, connections in places that matter. If we want to take them down, we need more than just public outrage." Marion sat down. "Then what's the next move?" John hesitated. "I need to find someone willing to go on record, a witness, someone inside their operation who's willing to talk." Marion sighed. "That's not going to be easy." John nodded. "I know, but there has to be someone. Someone who's scared enough, fed up enough to turn against them." Before Marion could respond, John's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a blocked number. John answered. "Yeah?" A man's voice, low and hurried. "You want to know the truth about the Hell Wolves?" John's pulse spiked. "Who is this?" "You don't need to know, but I saw your video, and I know things, real things, things that'll bury them if they get out." John's grip on the phone tightened. "Then tell me." There was a pause. "Not over the phone. Meet me in 1 hour, parking garage, 5th and Broadway, come alone." The line went dead. John lowered the phone, his mind racing. Marion frowned. "That sounds like a setup." "Maybe," John admitted. "But if it's real, this could be what we need." Marion exhaled. "Then I'm coming with you." John shook his head. "No. If something happens, I don't want you in the middle of it." Marion folded her arms. "I'm not some fragile old woman, Cena." John sighed. "I know, but I need you safe." Marion studied him for a moment before nodding reluctantly. "Fine, but you be careful." John grabbed his jacket, his muscles coiled with tension. He didn't trust this, but if there was even a chance this informant was real, he had to take it. 1 hour later, John pulled into the dimly lit parking garage. The place was nearly empty, the air thick with the smell of oil and exhaust. His footsteps echoed as he moved cautiously toward the designated spot. A shadow moved. A man stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, his hood pulled low over his face. "You alone?" the man asked, glancing around nervously. John kept his stance relaxed but ready for anything. "Yeah," the man exhaled. "Good. Listen, I don't have much time. Rick and his guys, they're not just running drugs and guns, they're deep in trafficking. People, women, kids, that's how they really make their money." John's stomach twisted. He had suspected they were dirty, but this was worse than he imagined. The man continued. "They use the bars, the strip clubs they own as fronts. And the cops, they know. They let it happen. You ever wonder why they're so untouchable? That's why. Too many people making money off it." John's fist clenched. "Why are you telling me this?" The man swallowed hard. "Because I can't live with it anymore. But if they find out I'm talking..." A gunshot rang out. The man's body jerked as a bullet tore through his chest. John lunged forward, catching him before he hit the ground. Blood spilled across the pavement as the man gasped for air. John's eyes snapped up, scanning the garage. The sound of a motorcycle engine roaring to life sent his adrenaline surging. He barely caught a glimpse of a black helmet disappearing into the darkness before the shooter was gone. John looked down. The man's lips moved weakly. John leaned in. "Who else is involved?" The man's breath shuddered. "Too many." Then his body went still. John clenched his jaw, rage and frustration burning in his chest. Rick's people had been watching. They knew. And now they had just silenced the only person willing to talk. John took out his phone and dialed Marion. "We have a problem," he said, his voice hard as stone. Marion's response was immediate. "What happened?" "They just killed my informant." A pause. Then Marion's voice was sharp, unwavering. "Then we hit them harder." John's eyes darkened. "Yeah, we do." The fight had just gone to another level. John Cena stood over the lifeless body of the informant, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The stench of burnt gunpowder still lingered in the air. He had barely caught a glimpse of the shooter before they disappeared into the night, and now the only man willing to expose the Hellwolves was dead. The message was clear. They were willing to kill to protect their empire. John inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. This wasn't over. Not even close. He turned and walked out of the parking garage, his mind racing. He dialed Marion as he reached his car. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "At home," Marion replied. "What happened?" John hesitated before answering. They silenced him. A heavy silence stretched over the phone before Marion finally spoke. Then they just made their biggest mistake. John drove through the darkened streets, his grip tight around the steering wheel. The anger in his chest wasn't just about the informant. It was about everything. The corruption, the police covering for them, the smug arrogance of Rick and his crew thinking they were untouchable. He had tried to handle things without escalating further, but they had crossed the line. By the time John reached Marion's apartment, his decision was made. He knocked once, and she opened the door almost immediately. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked, her expression unreadable. John nodded. "I'm sure." Marion stepped aside, letting him in. "Then let's hit them where it hurts." John sat down at the small kitchen table as Marion pulled out a folder filled with notes, records, and old reports. "I've been keeping track of these bastards for years," Marion said. "They think they're careful, but there are always cracks." She flipped through the pages. Money trails, properties owned under fake names, missing persons cases that always seemed to lead back to them. John leaned forward. "If we expose enough of this, they won't be able to hide behind their connections anymore." Marion smirked. "That's the idea." John pulled out his phone and started recording. He wasn't going to wait for a news outlet to break the story. He was going to break it himself. "This is John Cena, and if you thought what you saw before was bad, you need to hear this." He laid it all out: the trafficking, the drug operations, the police protection, the murder of the informant who tried to help. He showed the documents, the reports, the undeniable connections. He made it clear that this wasn't just about a gang. It was about a system of power and fear that had gone unchecked for too long. Then he ended with the most important part. "I'm not backing down, and I'm not the only one. The whole world is watching now, and we're going to make sure these people answer for what they've done." He posted the video. Within an hour, it had millions of views. The public reaction was instant and furious. News stations scrambled to pick up the story. Politicians who had ignored the Hellwolves for years suddenly started calling for investigations. Pressure piled on the police department to explain their connections to the gang. But John knew the real fight was still coming. Rick wasn't the type to go down quietly. John's phone rang again. This time it wasn't an unknown number. It was Rick himself. John answered. "Figured I'd be hearing from you." Rick's voice was cold, seething with rage. "You think this is going to change anything? You think a few tweets and some news reports are going to stop us?" John smiled slightly. "Looks like it already has." Rick exhaled heavily. "You don't get it, do you? You just put a target on your back." John's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "No, Rick, I just put one on yours." Rick laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you're safe? You think people like you always win? You're a fool, Cena." John's patience finally snapped. "And you're dead man walking. You just don't know it yet." Rick ended the call without another word. John exhaled slowly. He turned to Marion, who was watching him with calm determination. "They'll come for me," John said. Marion nodded. "I know." John sat back, stretching his fingers. "But this time, the whole world is watching." By morning, the FBI had opened an investigation into the Hell Wolves. More victims came forward. Their empire was crumbling before their eyes. Rick and his top men tried to run, but there was nowhere left to hide. A week later, John received the call. Rick had been arrested on multiple charges, and his gang was falling apart from the inside. John stood by Marion as they watched the news. Rick, in handcuffs, his face twisted with rage, being dragged into a police van. Marion smirked. "Told you, they always fall." John chuckled. "Yeah, but this was a good one." As the screen cut to black, John knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't over. Not for him, not for Marion, not for anyone who had ever faced men like Rick, but for tonight they had won, and that was enough. Justice has been served, but the fight is far from over. Some battles don't end with just one victory. They need people willing to stand up and fight for what's right. What would you have done in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story.